All right, so I'm going to cover the reading for this week with two different PowerPoints and two different videos. So this will be the part one, and what I want you to get out of the initial part of the chapter we read, and then the short other supplemental piece, is to understand basically some of the policies of the boarding schools. I mean, I think that's the overall emphasis is really to understand the boarding schools for Native Americans in the United States better, understand the process of assimilation that was used in the schools, and then the impact that it had on individuals and their families and the reservations, maybe more generally. The underlying reason, I mean, the deeper reason that I focus on these issues are for two things. I think one is that so far, we've seen with Jefferson, the envisioning of schools in the US, and with Horace Mann and the next major, drive for public schools, a focus and emphasis on cultivating a common culture, assimilation to assimilate immigrants into the United States. And I always make the point that I would not start from the position or from the perspective that that's a bad thing. I think it's been a really helpful component of our culture that we've tried to create similar values, that we've tried to create common connections among people. And that's an incredibly important part and a role that I think schools play. But I think that the good thing about this week in understanding this history is to understand how it can go too far, and how trying to strip people of their culture and take away their culture is a at least very problematic, given the history, kind of problematic approach. The other thing is that I kind of hope as a secondary sort of aspect of this that that teachers would understand better Native history, understand a little bit the history of schools more generally, and why certain communities in the United States maybe are apprehensive or weary of public schools, and that teachers would hopefully present a more complex and nuanced view of Native history. And to give you an example of this, this picture is one from and you can never capture the entire, but from the Navajo Nation. And this is, I always like to share my own experience. When I moved from Baltimore out to New Mexico, that was my first experience visiting a reservation. And I've visited many times the different parts of the Navajo Nation in both in New Mexico and Arizona, and then I've visited Apache reservations and some others in the state. And I think that it's always pretty. When I first went, it was pretty eye opening and a bit jarring, and I just remember feeling so naive. I sort of grew up with my only exposure to Native Americans being kind of teepees and arrows and this kind of distorted view, and to see, widespread poverty. I think that a lot of reservations really have conditions that just people would not associate with the United States, that they would associate more with developing countries, um, feral dogs, lack of resources, and you got to remember that Native Americans were moved to these lands, moved off of their lands and to these areas. Um, and so, although I do want to also make a really important point that reservations are very different, and I'm not trying to overgeneralize to all reservations. They are very different, and the ones, for example, in that I'm familiar with in Michigan and in different areas have visitor centers. They're very nice areas. So there's a broad spectrum of reservations. But after New Mexico, I did my graduate work, and then I was in North Dakota for a year working, and there I worked on a project called Early Reading First. That was a broad national program, but in North Dakota, the idea where I was working was to bring natives uh, into the schools on the Lakota reservations, and and to help support language development of the indigenous language. And that's something that'll connect to what we're going to talk about. Um, and by far, I would say the Lakota reservations in New Mexico, like Pine Ridge, are some of the most impoverished and face some of the most difficult challenges that I've seen. out of reservations around the country. I always like to point to different current events when I teach this. At one year, when the Revenant won the Oscar, that movie had used native actors. I've talked about sports teams and mascots. I'm going to kind of brush over that today and not go really in depth. But the Washington Redskins would be the most current example, and this too I think highlights the lack of understanding that so many in the U.S. have when it comes to natives, that we don't even have really a kind of complex, nuanced argument. It's so divided, and I think if you can better understand that, I share with this lecture videos on that are linked on Canvas, supplemental videos, and the one by Aaron Huey I would really recommend watching. It gives you a really good understanding of kind of what led up to the boarding schools. He covers in a very short period of time a very complicated history and gets to the Wounded Knee Massacre, where hundreds of men, women, and children were slaughtered, put into a mass grave, and this really changed dramatically the dynamics of the reservation, and led reformers to want to do something different, which was the boarding school, the last phase that's on this chart here that I have, the cultural assimilation. After people kind of lost their taste a little bit for war, and then for Native Americans, it ended their way of life. I mean, they were kind of trapped on the reservation at that point. So hunting buffalo, other things like that they were cut off from, and so that's why the schools became a viable issue. In the Aaron Huey talk, he mentions that if the Lakota treaties had held, that this is what the United States would look like today. The Lakota would still control a massive amount of land. And I thought I'd mention that 4 months ago, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld an old standing treaty that hadn't been acknowledged, which basically gave half of Oklahoma to Native Americans, control over, so that Native Americans, Oklahoma is now almost evenly divided, where half of it belongs to Native tribes. And those tribes were moved from the East Coast out to the Oklahoma Territory, originally as part of the Trail of Tears. All right, so that kind of brings us to where we are today, and the new focus on schools. And I like for you to understand the underlying belief system. And a good person to look at for that is Richard Henry Pratt. And that's somebody I want you to be familiar with. And his famous quote that I think helps you to understand the emphasis of the schools is, and I mean, he just said explicitly, our goal is to kill the Indian to save the man. That quote gets used a lot as a way to describe the underlying approach and ethic of the schools, what their ultimate aim was. It was to kill off the culture and identity of Native Americans. And so that process of assimilation, I broke down into a graphic organizer, and I'll try to go through this. It's a fair amount of information, but I do want you to be familiar with each section. And in each section, there's generally like some surface level things, but then a deeper rationale that was used. So for example, with hair, people at the boarding school said, we want to cut the hair to control lice. It's more hygienic, things like that. Those were the kind of surface, or, the surface issues. The underlying, the real deeper rationale for cutting off the hair. And when we talk about this here, we're talking about the males have, long black hair that they grow out. Their long hair was associated with savagery. And so they were considered to be savage, and it was removing that identity or that aspect of them. For Native Americans, and especially for the Sioux, growing the hair long was part of their culture, and cutting it off would have only been done in mourning, the loss of a revered relative or a loved one. So it was a deeply emotional event for them. And in the reading, that's described kind of vividly with the one boy who resists having his hair cut, and then eventually walks out into the courtyard and cuts it off himself, that kind of dramatic moment where all the kids are crying out and wailing. So it was a deeply emotional experience for them. In terms of the names, again, surface level issues were given by the boarding school. They're hard to translate, they're long, it's difficult for teachers to remember them, all these things. The real underlying deeper issue was that for Anglos, transferring property through a surname uh, was just so embedded in their kind of ideas of reality that was really the reason they needed to have a kind of clear recorded surname to transfer property. That was very different for from native culture. And when you look at the process, originally they just would give them random names. It really seems horrible to me. They would just kind of, the way that dogs are given names when they're brought to a shelter, they would just randomly pick a name. So there's examples like Julius Caesar, kids being called, Harriet Stowe, Beecher Stowe, just named after famous people, things like that. Eventually that changed and they were given an Anglo first name and native last name. And what's interesting to me that is when I think of my, friends who are native, uh, like Nick Running Bear, like they'll have an Anglo first name and then a native last name. So that's really had a lasting impact. And in terms of the impact of the name, we'll kind of get this, but sometimes they were lost in the system, in the boarding school system after a name change. They literally could not track them after their names had changed. Appearance, again, to give them uniforms, things like that, basic things. Um, but they really wanted to strip their identity, and to do that, they took away their individuality and put them in uniforms. And so, there were examples given where kids noticed like the wives of some of the officers wearing their blankets and different family heirlooms and things like that. For Native Americans, the significance with appearance is that individuality was a key trait that they valued. Uh, and then language, this isn't covered quite as deeply in the chapter that we read, so you don't need to know quite as much about this. But Native culture is one that's passed down often through stories. And so when they took away the language of the students, and language, that is what's important to remember, that students were punished and forbidden from speaking their native language. And the impact of this is that many of them, after they left the boarding schools, drifted back to the reservations, but then were unable to really communicate. It created a barrier between them and their family and their culture. All right. So this, I think, basically details what I just kind of went over. I always like to point out that these photos are easy to find. There are not a lot of photos necessarily from the boarding schools, but these transformation photos are really easy to find. They took a lot of them to promote the boarding schools. They would use these to say, look at the great job we're doing, and to raise money and those types of things. And there were boarding schools around the country, but of course, the example that we have from the reading that's given, that's detailed a little bit more than the others, because it was one of the largest and because it was the model for boarding schools, was Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that's where a lot of them went from out west all the way to the east coast of Pennsylvania. And the example in the reading is by train. And there's some pictures that I did include, and you can kind of see the boys lined up on one side, the girls on the other. They're all dressed alike. You can see kind of the militaristic style barracks that were there. The kids lived there. Often in the summers, they went rather than going home, they would stay with white families. The idea is that they would learn the habits and things like that. And so one of the things that I also want you to know and be familiar with that was from the supplemental reading was the process of kid catching. Now, David Wallace Adams in the chapter notes that many of the kids went off to boarding schools in different ways. Some of them went voluntarily. Some of them, the families, approved of them going off. But in many cases, they did not go voluntarily, and the families did not approve. And in these cases, when I ask about the process of kid catching, the kids were captured, oftentimes tied up, thrown in the back of pickup trucks, and taken off to the schools. And if they were to more local school and they tried to run away, then often they were shipped off to another school. So they were forced to go to schools and sometimes passed around to the different boarding schools. There was the main one I've talked about in Carlisle, and then there was another one, a large one in Kansas called Haskell. The governor of Kansas a while back actually designated parts of that old boarding school campus as historic memorial site. And the one at Haskell has actually, that school converted now to a native college. It's like one of the only individual native colleges in the country. So I'll post on the Canvas site a trailer for the movie Rabbit Proof Fence. This is, and what I like to emphasize here is that the boarding schools not only happened in the United States, they, and that's part of the reading at the end. The person who wrote it, it's part of congressional testimony by an anthropologist, and he says this is happens all too much for me to think it's just by accident. Like there's a design here, and it was, and so it happened in Australia, in Canada, and the United States. Australia's used the term the stolen generation to talk about it. It's been talked about in Canada. The Prime Minister apologized for it not too long ago, a few years ago, I believe. Justin Trudeau apologized for the boarding schools, and we haven't done that. I mean, I think in most people, this is new information. They don't know about the boarding schools, and I think that that's problematic. When you see if you ever watch the movie, it's dated now, it's a bit old, but they used indigenous actors, and one of the really interesting scenes is that you can see in the trailer is when the mother, that they're the moms in the movie who watch their daughters being physically taken away, captured, and taken off to the school, and those women actually experienced that as children. They used indigenous actors. They used actresses who had been through the boarding schools for the movie. It's based on a true story, and so it's this interesting dynamic because then their children, who are native actors who were playing the children in the movie, get to kind of see what their moms went through when they were young. So it's a very like palpable emotional scene that's captured in the movie. But again, just to note that it happened in other countries, and that it is something that's well documented, the kid catching aspect of it. All right. So I think I've covered a lot of key points here, and again, I will go into more in a second kind of PowerPoint lecture. I just do want to point out one of the questions I ask on the handout is the impact on individuals and on families. And the example that I like to use for this is Joe and Jody Pruitt, who are mentioned in the kid catching article by Dana Coolidge, because their story is kind of emblematic of what a lot of families experience. And essentially, they had about 10 children. The way that he words it is a little awkward, so I get the numbers like 7 or 8 confused a little bit. But essentially, the majority of those children died. 7 or 8 of those children died in the boarding school. And that's something we're going to talk about in the second lecture. Another one was lost in the system because of a name change. At least at the time of this testimony, they were unable to locate that child. And then Coolidge, the anthropologist basically says, I recommended that the family go into the mountains and hide with their remaining 2 children to prevent that. And the other example of individual impact is that, again, a lot of the children after the schools drifted back to the reservations, and they were just not prepared. The reservations, often agriculture was a big way of life. They were not prepared for that, trained. Language barriers, which made life very, very difficult. And here's another photo just to give you an idea of Carlisle, the kind of size and scope. It's probably hard to see all of the little children, but you can see just exactly how many faces and children they are. There's been some ongoing issues in the next lecture I'll cover with Carlisle and the kids who died there. And so again, I think some of the details I've covered are sort of spread out over these slides, but I do put a lot of slides in this, so I'm trying to get to the main clear points. So one of the problems is the loss of languages that happened as a result of the languages being forbidden on the reservation, and those policies were in place in schools well into the late 1970s and into the early 80s. So you're only really getting, a generation of kids now who are beginning to grow up with access at least to their native languages. Um, and again, that was part of the project that I was working on. It was to teach literacy more broadly, to teach English and English literacy, reading and writing, but to do that alongside of the native language. And it's a challenging endeavor, and education achievement too is limited. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll pick up with a second lecture where I'll go a little more in depth on these issues.